ADA 30 Idaho Interview Series. Marcie Roth, interviewed by Jeremy Maxson.
Okay, welcome folks. My name is Jeremy Maxson. I'm the Executive Director of Living Independence Network Corporation, or LINC, in Boise. And this is another installment of the interviews that we're doing with leaders in the disability rights movement as part of the 30th year anniversary celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I have the pleasure of being joined by Marcie Roth, who is an incredible, amazing advocate in the disability rights movement, particularly in emergency preparedness. The title of this interview is Emergency Preparedness, Surviving the Disaster and the Response. I want to start by thanking you, Marcie, for joining us, and I want to give our folks tuning in just a really short highlight of your background and what you've been involved in, which is it's extensive and impressive. You started out as being involved in the independent living movement in 1982, and we'll talk a little bit about that here shortly. You've been involved with policy and advocacy since 1995, it sounds like, and after September 11th, 2001, we're immediately involved in kind of the response to make sure that folks with disabilities were being included in that response. That led you to work for the Obama administration from 2009 to 2017, and you were charged with establishing and building up FEMA's disability integration cadre, which was a huge part of the national government's response and inclusion of folks with disabilities in emergency preparedness. And in 2017, you helped establish the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies, which is strong and ongoing and is actively involved in the response to COVID today and every day. And in 2019, you became the executive director of the World Institute on Disability, doing global work around operationalizing inclusiveness for folks with disabilities in all sorts of things. Absolutely incredible background, and I know from being on calls with you the depth of knowledge and experience that you bring to all the questions and all the issues that we've been dealing with around COVID. And so it's a real pleasure to get to spend a little bit of time with you talking about where we were before the ADA with emergency preparedness and response, and where we are today, being in the middle of a global pandemic. So welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I was really excited that you invited me to do this with you. I've been watching you and very, very excited as you're assuming this new role, and love it that you're putting these discussions together. I'm glad to be involved.
Well, thank you. Why don't we just jump right into it? And I like to start just getting a sense of the background of folks and where you grew up, what your family was like, what the town it was like that you grew up in, and what your relationship is to all issues disability.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I was born in New York City. And moved to Connecticut when I was 4 years old. Lived there for most of my childhood, and then my family life got sort of disrupted, and I ended up leaving everything that was familiar. And moving to a new community with a bunch of very different circumstances. And then I got sent off to school. And along the way, I had always felt drawn to, I guess, early on, I was drawn to the issues affecting people with disabilities, not because I had yet acquired my own disability, I was just very interested in how people with disabilities were making their place in communities that were not at all welcoming. And when I was in high school, I had the opportunity to, well, not the opportunity, I had the responsibility to do community service work, and found myself volunteering at a state institution for people with disabilities. And at 13 years old, I was, they said, here is your classroom, 30 adults who had never had the opportunity to go to school before. Here they are, you're going to be their teacher. I look back on that and I talk about it a lot now, how utterly ridiculous that was. However, needless to say, they taught me far more than I ever could have taught them. And that's when I first became aware of the unbelievable injustice of institutionalization and exclusion, low expectations. The folks who were in this classroom, we became friends, and we remained friends for many, many years after. And I'm still friends with some who are still alive. And so, one thing led to another, and I just, had one opportunity after another to be involved in the very, very early disability rights movement. Being in Connecticut, one of the original authors was Senator Lowell Weicker, dad of a young man with Down syndrome. And because Senator Weicker was in Connecticut, the state that I was living in, and I was working, I first went to work for an independent living center in 1982, I think, the Center for Independent Living of Greater Bridgeport. And I did that as part of my role with an organization that was in those days called the Western Connecticut Association for the Handicapped and Retarded. And I was funded to do rural outreach for the Independent Living Center. Fortunately, we changed the name of the previous name to the Western Connecticut Association for Human Rights. We put some power into that H and R. We were also a protection and advocacy agency, so I kind of got to do a lot of double dipping in all of that. So, early on, I worked in institutions. Prior to my job with the Independent Living Center, I worked in a group home. I worked in a sheltered workshop. I worked with children in segregated classes. And then, over the years, worked in a number of other roles, doing home studies for children from other countries who were coming to the U.S. for medical care that they couldn't get at home, and arranging foster homes for them during their stay. I got involved in a lot of other sort of tangentially disability rights work, but my heart was always in, the rights work, the civil rights of people with disabilities. So in 1988, I had the incredible opportunity of testifying at the one of the field hearings, the first time the ADA was introduced, with, Senator Weicker and my dear friend Tony Coelho, Representative Tony Coelho, with whom I'm very good friends today. We work together on a lot of stuff. And so, when we got the ADA passed in 1990, that was just an amazing, people had come together from across the country. We didn't have cell phones, and we didn't have internet, and we didn't have, any of the technology that, we sort of take for granted today. And here we are talking on Zoom. We organized these amazing postcard drives where we were sending thousands and thousands and thousands of postcards to senators and Congress folks, to plead with them to support the ADA. And we used these like neon paper. Mm-hmm. So pink and green, I can picture it very clearly. These neon pink and neon green postcards. And we would have like big community events, mm-hmm. and people would come out and we would just, fill out those postcards. And then when the ADA actually got passed, I felt like anything was possible, and then I felt a real strong desire to be a part of what happened next. So then I headed to DC, and I can tell you more about that, or I will let you ask another question.
So you made the connection. You talked just briefly about folks with disabilities in other countries, and that was something very small that you mentioned. But the work you do today is very, very much focused on global disability, inequality, and inclusion. Were those the initial seeds that were planted in your mind about the need for the work to be global?
Yes. But even before that, the town that I grew up in was where the headquarters of Save the Children was.
Okay.
And so I did a lot of volunteer work. I was a Brownie, and I was a Girl Scout, and the penny boxes for UNICEF on Halloween. I was really, really into what at the time was probably a big time charity model, but really drawn to humanitarian issues, and those global issues. But it was really, for me, it was I was so drawn to the circumstances of people with disabilities. I worked at this institution. I went back there several times and had a number of different jobs there for a couple of years. And I had this job where I was working in a cottage with 40 women who had, pretty significant support needs. And my job, one of my jobs, was to assist them at mealtime. And, every day the food would come out, and there would be a a brown sort of scoop of pureed food and a white pureed scoop of food and a green pureed scoop of food. And then there would be a dessert. And the women that I was supporting had very clearly never been given a whole lot of opportunity to indicate choice, preferences, and it occurred to me that, like, some people like to eat all of their vegetables first, or they like to have a little scoop of veggie and meat and, potato, starch, whatever, all on the same plate. Some people don't like it to touch, and some people want to eat their dessert first. And, so I just sort of innately was like trying to figure out with the each individual, trying to figure out like what their preference was. And I got in trouble big time. I almost lost my job because I was spending too much time with each person. And I very clearly remember the day that it occurred to me that there was something really wrong with what was going on here. Mm-hmm. And I was like maybe, 17 or 18 at that point. And I thought, okay, this is just not okay. So anyway, my international interests were, more than anything, because any example of injustice was really, I've often said, when something hits my righteous indignation bone, I'm at my best when I am feeling righteously indignant, justifiably righteously indignant. So
there's certainly plenty of opportunity for that.
Ain't it the truth?
So this is actually a really great segue into a conversation around emergency preparedness. When we think about folks with disabilities being warehoused and institutionalized, and when support staff can't even ask a question about what makes somebody unique, or what are their personal desires, or what are they, how do we help make sure people are living truly independent lives and making decisions for themselves, and have control over their future. It makes me really wonder, what kind of response can we have as government and as communities in disasters when we know that people are stressed and resources are limited and time is limited, and it's so easy for life to slip through people's fingers in a disaster. And it really, I think, drives home the importance of this conversation and the work that you've done around emergency preparedness and response. And so maybe just talk a little bit about what happened that initiated that work.
Sure.
And what you learned.
Sure. By the time I, on September 11th, I was driving to work. I was the director of advocacy and public policy for NCLE, the National Council on Independent Living. And I was driving to work, same routine every day. The traffic in DC is ridiculous. I had a, fairly long commute every day, and day in and day out, I'd be driving to work, coffee cup in hand, national public radio on, and I heard that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And, I had this sort of visual in my head of, a six-seater plane or, some small, private plane, and, how unfortunate. But then as I'm listening, it's starting to get a little clearer that this might have been a bigger thing. Then I heard them say, we're now getting word that there's been a second plane. We're not sure if these are additional reports of the first plane or if this is actually a second plane. Moments after that, I always drove along the Potomac River to get to work at Nickel. And as I'm listening to this and I'm stuck in traffic, there's a plane that's flying over the Potomac. I've been driving this road every single day. Certainly, I've seen planes come and go on that path. Something about this one was just different. And I sort of laughed at myself like, oh, come on, don't be ridiculous. And then I came around the corner where the Pentagon is. And as I came around that corner, there was this massive fireball. And I was just about at work. I went, racing inside. And I'm, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, look. And, we had a window that, could face out, pretty much in that direction. And they're all, the rest of the Nickel folks are like, come here, you've got to see what's going on. And I'm like, no, you got to see what's there. So we're sort of back and forth because I saw what was happening here. They're watching on TV what's happening in New York. Anyway, 2 days later, after just this, horror, I got a phone call from Brad Williams, who's the soap director in New York, has been for years. And Brad said, there's a problem in New York City. And I'm like, dude, I know. And he said, no, we've got this additional problem. We have thousands of people who live in the area around Ground Zero. They've cordoned off that area. And the only people who can get in are people who can show identification that they live there. So that frozen zone, thousands and thousands of people live there. If you needed personal assistance services and you had somebody coming from another part of the city, that person couldn't get in. If you used paratransit, the paratransit driver couldn't get in. There was the TV crawl, the news crawl on the bottom of the TV, but there was just a little bit of captioning, but it was never lined up quite right. So the crawl and captioning and the station identification, they would all sort of, mix up. And so, nobody was getting information. It was just, overwhelming how many people had needs that no one was taking into consideration. And all of a sudden, I'm sort of finding myself in a position where, first of all, I'm thinking, who's responsible? How does this emergency thing work? How does this, who do you call? And I thought, well, I'm going to call that organization the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I called up FEMA and I said, I'd like to talk to the person who handles disability issues. And there wasn't anybody. And long story short, I found myself on my way into the White House to talk about, ways that we could immediately address the disability issues. And that started a long journey that, I got very involved in the early days of the Department of Homeland Security and the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, who took a very big interest in disability, the rights of people with disabilities in emergencies. And then in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina struck, I was called by Susan Daniels, who was a longtime fabulous leader in the movement. Her sister-in-law, who was quadriplegic, had been trying to evacuate from her apartment in the upper ninth ward for 3 days. And Benilda Cachetta had lots of friends and lots of people sort of trying to figure out with her how she could evacuate, but nothing quite came together. And, I was back and forth on the phone with her all day trying to get some help to her. But there was a point where, as bad as Hurricane Katrina was, it was starting to look as though the hurricane was passing. And, the forecasters are like, things are going to get better really fast, really soon. And I told Benilda, the weather report is, things are starting to look good. And she said to me, the water is rushing in. And then we lost phone contact. I believe she has had some conversations with some other folks in and around that time, but she and I were not I was not able to reach her. I kept trying to call her back. I wasn't able to reach her. Of course, what I didn't know at that time was, that the levees had failed. And, they found Benilda's body a number of days later. And, for me, I was already really concerned about what happened for people with disabilities in disasters. I had also, in that period after the terrorist attacks, I had gotten very involved in the Indian Ocean tsunami, following the earthquake, and an earthquake in Iran, and a number of other catastrophic events. And so, after 2005, and Benilda's death, and then at that point I was the executive director of the National Spinal Cord Injury Association, and we did a lot of work around specific supports for people with spinal cord injuries. And one thing just led to another, and I just kept finding myself understanding more and more about how this emergency management system worked and how it didn't work, and how the laws that I had fought so hard for were not being implemented, that people were dying or having horrific impacts excuse me, because there was no effort to plan for and with people with disabilities. And then 2009, I had the amazing opportunity to go to FEMA, and I worked directly for the administrator, because after Katrina, there was a piece of legislation, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, that we had worked really hard to get passed. One of the requirements that FEMA had after that was to have a disability coordinator. And that person had a bunch of responsibilities. So in 2009, I was brought on board to focus on those elements. Additionally, I was asked to establish an Office of Disability Integration and Coordination, and then build a disability integration advisor cadre of disability experts who would deploy out during disasters.
And those folks are still active. I mean, we work pretty closely with our regional disability integration specialist, who's fantastic, who you know.
Really fantastic.
And I just wanted to interrupt you because I wanted to emphasize how important the work that you did at FEMA is, and to put it into context for people who may not, understand how these things get done and how the world changes by laws and by policy and by the hard work of people on the ground. But when you pass a law, that's just the passage of a law, and that doesn't mean that all the systems and the institutions and the organizations and the agencies, all of those things don't immediately snap into line. And they don't automatically solve all the problems that folks with disabilities face every day. I mean, in a disaster, on a good day, I guess, on a blue skies day, public transit and access to mobility, public transportation is hit or miss in a lot of places. Some cities it's really great, but some places it really doesn't exist. And so when you think about, okay, in a disaster, all of a sudden we're going to miraculously know how to move people with disabilities out of harm's way or relocate or evacuate. On a good day, that those systems don't work well. So the expectation that in a disaster, all of a sudden, those problems are going to go away is really unrealistic. And the only way to get traction on these issues is to have people talking about it all the time, and to have people raising these issues in every context. And so what you did, and what I'm so appreciative of, just as somebody who has benefited from that, is that you basically forced the government in a way to have those conversations all the time, all over the place. And it's not perfect, and it hasn't solved all the problems, but it certainly brought people to the table who hadn't been at the table. And as you know, in places like Idaho, we like to say that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and we prefer to be at the table.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to.
Oh, I'm just going to add. Unfortunately, sometimes even if you're at the table, you're on the menu, but at least then you're a little more aware that it's coming.
Yeah, and so I wanted to just contextualize that for folks who don't pay a lot of attention to the emergency management space, or how laws actually impact change on the ground, and just how important that work at FEMA still is today, even though what we'll talk about in a little bit are the barriers and the problems that we still see in existence, and pretty serious as we've been progressing through this global pandemic, COVID-19. So maybe can you, what did you, after FEMA and the work you did at FEMA, there's probably a few more things you want to mention about that, but then you pivoted in a sense and started a nonprofit organization focused on disability and emergency preparedness and response. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the partnership and the work that the partnership does today.
Sure. So, when my time at FEMA came to an end, I I had done some consulting before I went to FEMA, and I had intended to do some consulting afterwards, but was given a really great opportunity to sort of do the flip side of what I had been doing at FEMA. One of the challenges when I was at FEMA was there just weren't a lot of community folks, disability rights leaders, who were taking on this very important aspect of the rights advocacy focus. And, I wished when I was at FEMA that people were pushing me harder. And then, when I now was in a position to be on that other side, I decided to, build an organization of organizations, a coalition of disability leaders who, would come together with emergency management and, build capacity across the country. So in a very short amount of time, I started with the partnership on literally the day I left FEMA. And within a month, 6 weeks, we did a national meeting on disability inclusion in disasters, and had about, if I remember, I think we had about 130 people come to DC, and we had folks joining us remotely. And we had this, fabulous day-long meeting, and moved very quickly to build this organization. And then, that was the summer of 17, which, on August 25th, Hurricane Harvey made landfall. And then, right after that, Hurricane Irene. And then right after that, Hurricane Maria, with 2 other hurricanes in between that both thankfully didn't make landfall or were very, inconsequential. But there were 5 hurricanes in the period of a month. And, it was just horrific, everything that was happening. And so at the partnership, we established a hotline. And I mean, we were literally getting calls from people who couldn't reach 911 and were on their roof because the water was so high, and could we please help them? And we engaged with the Cajun Navy folks, and literally plucking people out of the water. We arranged for airdrops of urgently needed medication and formula for a hospital NICU in the middle of the night. Lots and lots of really urgent needs that nobody else was filling. We worked very closely with trach mamas, who are, a wonderful organization of moms of kids with tracheostomies who gathered supplies, and we were arranging to ship disability supplies all over the country. The Pass It On Center, and all of the reuse programs with the Tech Act programs across the country. And we built these databases and just went at filling in the gaps. And among the work that we did was to deploy some folks to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And, two of the people that we deployed to Puerto Rico were Herman Parodi and Shaylin Sluzales, who have since become the co-executive directors of the partnership when I left to go to my new role at WIT. The other person, or one of the other people we deployed, was Todd Holloway, who we sent to the U.S. Virgin Islands. And, needless to say, this is a gang of folks who have all stayed together, and we've, continued to grow the family, and, have obviously the partnership has had sweeping impact. Herman and Shaylin deployed to the Bahamas 3 times after Hurricane Dorian. And they stood up a phone call that, on February 28th, and as Shaylin says, every day, we have been meeting each and every day since February 28th. And here we are at the end of July, and we have literally met every single day, Saturdays, Sundays, holidays, ever since, as we're dealing with the horrors of the pandemic.
Yeah, I got to give a shout out to Shaylin and Herman and definitely Todd Holloway. Definitely, they light fires under people and get things done, and learn so much from all of them in those daily calls. And when COVID started, I was working for the Silk in Idaho and had a focus on emergency preparedness, and so we were involved in the COVID response from the perspective of folks with disabilities, and that it was this kind of it still is a dark time, but I really learned a lot and benefited from just the camaraderie of those daily calls at the end of the day, just to commiserate, learn, share information, network, get ideas. And certainly Todd Holloway in Seattle, or he's in Pierce County or King County, I forget which one he's, and is both knowledgeable, experienced, and has a soothing radio voice, which calms me, and I really appreciate it. So I'm glad that you mentioned those 3.
And
so,
I have to also give a shout out to June Kales.
Absolutely.
June has been my partner in crime around emergency management. She taught me everything I know, and she's been at it for a very, very long time, and has tremendous contributions to building our process for pushing hard and trying to make change. And so here we are now, and as I'm speaking to you, it's now the 138th day since there was the declaration of a national emergency by the president. And as of yesterday afternoon, there were at least 65,000 disabled people who have died in congregate facilities from COVID. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. And it's, that those 65,000 individuals, virtually all of them people with disabilities, because you don't go to a nursing home because you're old. You go to a nursing home because you have a disability, and for whatever reason, your community has not put in place the supports and services that you need in order to, maintain your health, your safety, your independence, and your dignity in the community. And the same thing with virtually every other congregate facility. There is, there's, I think, 1.3 million people with disabilities in congregate facilities, and 2 million people with disabilities if you, expand that out. And then, of course, there's another 2 million people in, carceral settings, prisons, detention centers, jails. And of course, in and amongst those 4 million people, there are many who have, mental health support needs. Virtually, all people, I shouldn't say virtually all, many people in our prison system are people with disabilities. And we could have a whole separate conversation about why that is, but it's a fact. And, many of the people that we're talking about, generally in congregate institutional settings, and more specifically during the pandemic, many of these are people of color, Black, brown, indigenous, and for many, poverty is a very big piece of their life experience. And the lack of any awareness that these are all people who have civil rights protections, or were supposed to have civil rights protections. The fact that, these are all people who had a right to live in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs, a hard-won right that the Supreme Court affirmed 21 years ago in the Olmstead decision. So whether it's, the Rehab Act, which is, 47 years old, almost 50 years old, or whether it's the Americans with Disabilities Act, now 30 years old, or whether it's the Olmstead decision, 21 years old, or whether it's the, continual Stafford Act amendments, there are unwaverable rights that people with disabilities have. The rights of people with disabilities are not suspended in a disaster. They don't go on hiatus. There is no, there is no interruption to the rights of people with disabilities. And yet, here we are, 138 days after the declaration. This is a declared disaster. At least 65,000 people with disabilities have died. It's a genocide.
It
I
is a
mean,
genocide.
yeah. You know, I mean, I feel sometimes like I'm being hyperbolic, but it is the absolute, utter, horrific truth. And trying to get acknowledgement and, more importantly, action to protect the folks in institutions and in the community, to protect people who have these rights from finding themselves in circumstances that significantly increase their risk of exposure. You know, we, as we've talked about on these calls, there is a real opportunity, and there are folks across the country who are, you know, independent living centers across the country are like, you know, we know how to transition people out of nursing homes. We've been doing this for quite a while. We have a lot of successes under our belt. We're ready to do this. We know how to do this. We just need FEMA to tell the states that relocating people with disabilities in a disaster is an appropriate use of Category B public assistance funds. The you know, medical, I'm sorry, the emergency, oh, I can't, now I'm forgetting the term. I say it about 1,000 times a day. Emergency protective measures that are included in the public assistance Category B, clear as a bell. The states are having a difficult time making the move without assurances from FEMA that, yes, in fact, this is an appropriate use of that Category B emergency protective measures. And the lack of urgency people are dying while, you know, the powers that be go back and forth over whether or not this, you know, huge purse that FEMA has, whether or not any of that money can be spent on saving the lives of people with disabilities, whether or not any of that money can be directed towards disability-led organizations like independent living centers, like the many community-based organizations that serve people with disabilities on a daily basis, who are not getting, as you well know, because we've talked about this, not getting a dime in any of those resources. And, you know, we've had countless conversations, sometimes heated, but the lack of a sense of urgency, it's devastating. It really is. And, you know, as we know, in the middle of this, you know, maybe someday somebody's going to look back on this conversation and they're going to say, well, you know, here's how it turned out. I don't have a clue how this is going to turn out. Nobody has a clue how this is going to turn out. But I'm entirely sure that there are things we could do right now to save people's lives. There are things we could do right now to make sure that people who are in their home, in the community, are getting the supports and services that they need. there's a new bill that was introduced yesterday on the Senate side that doesn't include a dime of home and community-based service funding to keep people out of these very dangerous COVID-infested. The New York Times called them death pits, so I don't feel like I'm, being inappropriate when I use the term COVID-infested death pits. And may I tell you a story about someone that has been
Please.
caught up in this? So, and you may have even heard her on the call last week or the week before. Katie Willis is a disability advocate. She lives in Northern California. She jokes in a not so funny way that it seems like she very frequently finds herself in disasters being, one of the people with a disability who doesn't fare very well. Katie, lives in her own place, and she has a maximum number of hours from the California IHSS, which is like the in-home support services, I think it's called. She has maximum number of hours, and she does fine. But during COVID, she has not been able to get personal assistance service providers to work at the current rate that the state is paying. And, everybody's working from home, so it's very difficult to reach people. And she was unable to get enough support. She could find people who could work, but not at the rate that the state was paying. So rather than funding a higher pay, she was sent to a nursing home in the middle of this pandemic. So she's in the nursing home, which, by the way, is $600 a day compared to her IHSS, which was costing the state, I think, $140 a day. So, I mean, the price difference, even if you don't care about the human being, why is the state spending $600 a day when they were paying $140? Even if they had to double that, that's still less than half of what it's costing for her to be in this dangerous environment. Nobody could possibly defend this as a better alternative, So she figured out how to sort of, pull together enough resources. She was able to hire some folks on Craigslist. She got herself out of the nursing home. By the time she got home, one of the people she had hired didn't show up. 2 other people notified her that they were moving out of town. And the 4th person that she hired, said they weren't going to be able to continue to do the work, putting her back in a nursing home situation. So here we have all these folks who are dying, who are, completely off everybody's radar, and, clearly no sense of urgency. And then we have, and I have, unfortunately, many other stories of people who are being, institutionalized simply because our systems are, they're not just failing. Our systems they're stupid. As a taxpayer, why aren't people outraged that the
Well,
state is?
it definitely begs the question, who's the system working for?
Yeah,
And it's working for individuals who are trying to live independent, free lives
right.
in their communities. It's working for other people who benefit when you have nursing homes full.
Absolutely.
And that's unfortunate. I think that we talked before this interview about the need to continue to tell these stories and to create a vehicle through which to do that, because there are so many of these stories that need to be told, not only around COVID, and not only around emergency preparedness. So I think what we'll do is use that as a good stopping point. And we're going to continue this conversation at another time, because I know we've run out of time. But we did
Much more to say.
I think we did get through all the things we wanted to talk about. Marcie, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this. I know you're busy and your time is really valuable. And you've made such a huge contribution, and every day you continue to make a huge contribution to protecting people and making sure that people are living independent lives. And so, I know I can't thank you enough for that. And I just really appreciate the leadership that you bring to those calls and that you bring to this space, and the way you do it. And so it's, I just want to say thank you for that. And thank you for joining me on this interview.
You're going to make me all misty. Thank you very much. And I am so excited about your leadership and, the opportunity for us all to be building together what I hope will be a much better world when we come out the other side of this. We can't go back. We can't stay where we are. We have to move forward. And, I have found the crowd that I want to move forward with, and I'm darn glad that you're a part of it.
I am too, and I am glad you are too. Thank you for that. And thank you to the folks who joined us, who tuned in to share this, to experience this interview. And we'll catch you on the next interview that we post. So thanks for joining us.
Image description. A word collage in the shape of the United States with the word access highlighted and hashtag thanks to the ADA.